สัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. Many of you are probably familiar with the final teaching of the Buddha that mentioned all conditions are impermanent, so strive on with heedfulness. Heedfulness is this quality that embodies everything that the Buddha taught, and one of Ajahn Chah's favourite teachings, to be heedful. Because it embodies everything else, it has different aspects to it. He's just pointing out, whether it's the Buddha or it's Ajahn Chah, just pointing out the fact that life is unpredictable. It's one of our wishes, is to be able to control our life and make everything go the way we want, the way we plan, get everything we want, get everything done that we want to get done, and we want everything to go our way, not to have any problems, difficulties, obstacles, or if we do, to get through them quickly and easily. But then life is uncertain, it's impermanent. And this body and mind that we inhabit is constantly changing because they're conditioned things. And then the bodies and minds of other people are constantly changing, and then the world around us is constantly changing. So that sets up this stress in our minds, because we want to control everything and get it going the way we like. But then things are unpredictable and changing. And change tends to be stressful. So the Buddha encouraged us to practice heedfulness, to be heedful of the changing nature of the world, of our bodies, our minds, and then everything around us. Because he's giving us a tool or a reflection on how to deal with that simple fact that we can't control everything and make everything go the way we want, because it's full of the world is full of change. Sometimes we use the word heedfulness, which is appamada in Pali, interchangeably with mindfulness, sati, but heedfulness is really broader than mindfulness. Because heedfulness encompasses the whole of the path. Mindfulness is part of the path. We know the Noble Eightfold Path has 8 factors. Samma sati is one factor. Heedfulness is the whole of everything, the whole of the path. Everything fits into it. But you might say one aspect, central aspect to heedfulness is just the using our intelligence to recognize the way things are. It doesn't mean to say we're perfectly wise, perfectly peaceful, perfectly mindful. But just recognizing the kind of problem we face, that we can't control everything because all things are impermanent, all conditions are impermanent, subject to change. Heedfulness means using your intelligence to see, to know that fact, to be aware of that fact. So it makes you careful, it makes you mindful as well. Heedfulness makes you mindful, but it makes you careful, helps you to acknowledge certain things that you might not want to acknowledge or accept. Helps you to deal with the insecurity of not being able to control everything. So at least you know that's the way things are. So you can accept that. And the Buddha his teachings are all coming from a mind of full wisdom, understanding, we say the awakened mind, awakened to reality, but also compassion. He wants to help people understand their lives better, understand their minds better. So why would he teach this? Why would he teach us to accept that all things are impermanent? How can that help us? Why is that compassionate? Because it actually leads you to release some of the causes of suffering from your mind when you accept that all things are impermanent. It actually can lead to peace of mind, a release from these insecurities, because you realize you can't control everything, so then you stop trying to. So you let go of craving, controlling, the mind that wants to be in charge of everything, the boss, own everything, have everything. And that letting go actually can lead to great happiness and release, peace of mind. At the very least in our life, we have to accept that this body is getting older every day. And that's happening whether we like it or not. We can't control it. We can't, with all the technology and scientific advances and medical advances we have, we can't stop the fact that human bodies are aging. And with aging we get weaknesses. We don't look the same with aging, we don't feel the same. We can't do as much when we get older, much as we like to build ourselves up and train ourselves and keep ourselves as young and fit as we can. Sooner or later, aging gets us, doesn't it? Because nobody lives forever. And accompanying aging, we have sickness. And even with the fittest body in the world, we can still get sick. We can get injured. So nobody can escape from those things. The Buddha said, well, just notice, observe, that's the nature of reality. And it makes you a bit more heedful in that moment, doesn't it? It makes you more aware of the way things are, and then brings your mind to work out how you can deal with that. And one way you can deal with aging or sickness is accepting that's just nature, it's just reality, rather than fighting it or suffering over it. The very simple application of heedfulness, and to be heedful that we're getting older every day, and that one day we must die. And the mind that is, you might say, the mind that is not heedful doesn't like that kind of teaching, because it goes against what we want. What we want is to be young and active and do everything that the mind wants to do. And to do that you need to stay young, healthy, have all your faculties at your available to you to do what you want. But that's the way of heedlessness, because we take it all for granted. The Buddha wasn't trying to make us depressed. He's just trying to make us heedful of the way things are, so that we're careful. And maybe help us to prioritize in life what things are important within the sphere of what we can influence, what we can control. Because he didn't say we can't control anything, but he just warned us to be heedful of the fact that the mind, a lot of the time, is out of control, isn't it? And it's expecting things that are impossible, or trying to control more than we can. But he didn't say we can't control anything, because the whole of the Buddhist path is, you could say, a form of learning to discipline and control this body and mind and use it to do the highest good, to improve our experience and find greater peace and happiness. But he also was warning us to be heedful, because our mind keeps falling into delusion that says, I want to control everything and get everything I want. This is something you learn when you come to practice meditation, isn't it? Whatever you want will start to become an obstacle as soon as you're bringing mindfulness to pay attention to something like the breath. Your mind, that wanting already sets up a tension in the mind. Wanting things for the future, or even wanting right here, right now, as you're practicing, you may want to experience a different experience than you're having right now. Maybe you feel tired or painful, or have a lot of stressful thoughts or worries. Maybe you don't want any of that. But part of meditation is strengthening the mind so that you can accept and acknowledge, well, what is happening, what is coming up, rather than resisting it or wanting it to be different than it is. So as we keep practicing, it's a teaching to return to over and over again. How to be heedful within the midst of these changing conditions. How to prepare the mind. How to be careful, how to be mindful. And it leads on as you become heedful of change and the changing conditions of the world. And then it leads on to skillful action, maybe. For the Buddha, being heedful of old age, sickness and death led him to go out into the forest, practice meditation. The same with Ajahn Chah. He said when his father died, when he was a young monk, he changed his attitude a bit and made him very heedful of the fact that life is uncertain. The people we love and like around us, they're not going to be here forever, and we ourselves are not going to be here forever. So when you become heedful of something as simple as a fact, as simple as the fact of change, it tends to lead on to, say, energy, brings a sense of urgency to want to practice maybe, because you know time is limited and you know maybe there's things you still have to develop. It's the opposite of heedlessness, when we take everything for granted or become complacent. The mind goes to sleep towards the truth. It's the opposite of the awakened mind of the Buddha or an enlightened disciple of the Buddha like Ajahn Kalyano. It's the mind of just turning off to reality. And a lot of the time we try to do that, don't we? We try to just turn off because it's too much, or we're not ready for it, or we haven't developed the correct qualities yet, the heedfulness, so we just want to escape. So much of life is about seeking out ways to escape, successful ways to escape. But of course, ultimately we can't. We can only escape briefly into different kinds of sense pleasure, sensory experience, stimulation, excitement, things that absorb our attention for a while until that stimulation wears out, and then we're back to square one again. And sometimes we make things harder for ourselves because we fall into heedlessness, and that's a habit that reinforces itself. The obvious one is saying, if you're getting stressed in your work or your life, then you maybe start drinking to relieve some of the stress. And it seems to work for a while, you feel more relaxed, but then of course it's a habit, so after a while you become addicted to it, physically and mentally. And then you're stuck with a worse reality than you had before, maybe. Because you've only escaped through going into pleasant feelings, relaxed, lightheadedness, but then you have to come back to the reality, and you've got less strength of mind, less mindfulness, less intelligence to deal with whatever it is that's your problem. And that's the nature of the sensual realm that we live in. When we do become complacent or take things for granted, we become heedless. Then our mind actually becomes, you could say, a bit weaker. It gets harder to learn, harder to understand things, harder to face up to things, harder to be mindful. One of the ways Ajahn Kalyano talked about how to bring up heedfulness is living with other people or associating with other Dhamma practitioners. Say for monks, Luang Por Chah encouraged monks to value Sangha, community, and even though we sometimes go on retreat on our own, but to value the living in community, living as Sangha, because when you live with other practitioners, you get good reflections back on yourself, because we're not perfect and we are heedless. Some of the time we get lost in our greed, anger and delusion, we get lost in our views and opinions. And when you live with other practitioners, sometimes they make you heedful again when you've been heedless. They help you to wake up to your own speech, your own actions, simply by living with them. So for Sangha, we have a standard of behaviour. We call it the Vinaya, the monastic discipline. And so if you have a number of people practicing that, we develop certain accepted norms and ways of conduct, ways of behaviour that when you step outside of that norm, it becomes obvious. If not to you, because if you are heedless, you might not realize, but then other people do. So they can remind you. Sometimes they remind you just by example. Sometimes they actually tell you or explain things to you. But when you live in a community, that helps to become more heedful. And ideally, in the lay life, it's the same with, say, in a family situation or even a workplace. when one person is practicing heedfulness, they can have a good effect on the people around them. And we can pull each other up, we can remind each other through example or skillful speech, skillful example. And we help to encourage each other to rise up in our behavior, to have some good values and principles in the way we do things. It doesn't mean to say we can't be on our own, but the danger when you're on your own is that you can easily become complacent or heedless. You get less feedback, less support from others. So Luang Por Chah used to really value community living, because you get this reflection living with other people. And it can be hard as well, because when you live with other people, if they're not your relatives and not necessarily your friends, then there'll be people that you like, people you don't like, people have their different behaviors. But if you're all aspiring to a similar standard of behavior, the Vinaya, then it's still useful to live like that. We get some strength of energy. It's the same even in the lay life. So when you want to practice meditation, if you sit in a group, you usually get more energy from the people around you, don't you? When you see other people practicing meditation, then you try harder. If you're with other people who keep precepts, 5 precepts or 8 precepts, you tend to get more energy for your own practice, because you're seeing other people doing it, then you try harder yourself. It's the same idea. Practicing in a community tends to make you more heedful. You have maybe duties and responsibilities, you have things to do, you have meetings to go to, you have, say, if you meditate in a group, whether it's in a monastery or in a lay community, if you say you have a period of meditation that's agreed, we're going to sit for half an hour or 1 hour, well, when other people are doing it, you try harder, don't you, to complete that meditation session. If other people are putting effort into training their speech, their actions in mindfulness, then you tend to try harder with yours. And you see that all the time in monasteries. We pull each other up, meaning we help to raise our effort and raise our level of mind by each individual practicing for themselves, but practicing as a community. You influence each other in a good way. When the Buddha died, after the Buddha died, attained parinibbana, there were some monks who were smiling and said, we don't have to listen to the Buddha admonishing us anymore, telling us what to do, maybe we can relax some of the rules. So there were some monks that are happy. They were considered to be the heedless monks, because they didn't realize the value, what greater value than having an enlightened teacher like the Buddha. Even though our kilesas, our conceit, our attachments, our greed, anger, delusion, they don't always like to practice, so our mind grumbles and complains. It's normal, but to have enlightened teacher or to have sangha around is such a blessing. But then there's still some who don't see the value of it, and they're happy when the teacher's not there. Same with Ajahn Chah. When Ajahn Chah went away, then some of the monks might say, Ajahn Chah's not here, now we can relax. It's at those times you see the value of teachers or sangha, because they help to make us quite naturally or organically make us more heedful. When we're on our own, we might think we're heedful, but it's so easy to be complacent and heedless. But it doesn't mean to say we don't take responsibility for ourselves. So if we live in a community or we have good Dhamma friends to help us, it doesn't mean to say that means we give up on training ourselves and just put it all on other people to guide us, be good examples, remind us what we have to do. Is one part of the practice, but then also we have to learn how to do that for ourselves. The second part of heedfulness is in knowing how to remind yourself and teach yourself how to have conversations with yourself that bring up the Dhamma. Ajahn Chah used the phrase, Atano Joti Atanang. One has to remind oneself how to practice, what the practice is. Part of heedfulness is just what is the appropriate practice in each situation or each time or each moment through your day. So sometimes the appropriate practice is one of practicing generosity or kindness in a situation. Sometimes when you're on your own, maybe it's just to be mindful of your breath. At each moment we are doing different activities. Well, the practice might change slightly, but we have to learn how to bring up mindfulness, heedfulness in each moment. So we have to learn how to remind ourselves or teach ourselves. It's the idea of know yourself, whatever you're doing, whether you're on your own or whether you're with a few people or whether you're with a lot of people, to know yourself in every situation. It's natural sometimes when you do work with other people or live with other people, there'll be times when you want to get away, be on your own. And sometimes that's correct. Maybe you're tired or you need time for personal retreat and so on. And then there'll be other times when maybe your own personal practice is flagging and you realize, it's quite useful having other people around who practice because they give you some skillful inputs, good reflections. They can bring you up, they can assist you. Sometimes we need assistance in our life. No one is a complete island that they never need any advice or assistance from other people. But our mind often reacts, doesn't it? So sometimes we're happy to be with others, especially when we're feeling lonely or feeling tired. Other people can bring us up. But then sometimes we don't want to be with other people, we want to be on our own. If you just follow moods, then you're never satisfied, are you? So sometimes you have to rise above the moods and see the Dhamma in a situation. So sometimes the right Dhamma is to be with others. Sometimes the right Dhamma is to be on your own. As you become more aware of yourself and you practice heedfulness, you become more sensitive maybe to time and place and what you're doing and what's needed in a situation. Heedfulness isn't one thing or another, but it's heedfulness of the path, of the practice, sila, samadhi, panya, and developing the various qualities of the practice. Heedful of situations, heedful of dangers. It's another part of heedfulness, isn't it? The Buddha encouraged us to always be aware of the dangers and then see the escape from those dangers. So sometimes the escape, say when your practice is a bit weak, then sometimes the escape is to be with other practitioners. So they help to make you more mindful, more disciplined, more careful in what you say, what you do. So if you're particularly addicted to something that's not so helpful to you, say back to alcohol, you become addicted to alcohol, well, being heedful would be to spend time with people who don't drink. If you're trying to give up drinking, if you're a gambler and you're trying to give up gambling, or spend your time with people who don't gamble. might be the appropriate practice. That would be heedfulness in that situation. But then sometimes our problem is maybe we're a talker, we talk too much, spend all our time chatting. As soon as another person's around, we just want to talk. So then maybe the heedful thing to do is spend a bit more time on our own. Build up our own strength of mind, independence, so we don't need to always talk to other people. So we notice the more we talk, the more danger. Again, back to danger. The more we talk, we tend to talk about things that are more taking us away from the Dhamma, gossiping or just chit-chatting about stuff that's not that useful, filling our mind up with different memories and thoughts and moods. So heedfulness is not necessarily one thing or the other, but it's the appropriate practice for the situation, for your needs and for the situation. Sometimes people think, well, to be heedful you also have to be very slow in what you do. So especially when we go on retreat, we do these slow retreats with slow walking, sitting and then eating very slowly, very mindfully, and that can be very helpful. But then sometimes in life we need to speed up a bit, don't we? When there's an emergency, being heedful can sometimes mean having to act fast, make quick decisions and jump into action if there's some physical danger or some need. So also it means being able to reflect, and use wisdom and reflect on situations, use our intelligence to see what the appropriate action is, and then seeing what's needed to do to respond to a particular situation. There's not one thing or another. I remember once when I was a young monk in the monastery, somebody came who was trained in the slow method of walking and sitting, and they were used to doing retreats where they did everything super slow, which may be quite useful in a particular retreat where the conditions are very kind of controlled and it's an artificial situation, you might say. That might be fine. But then they were staying in the monastery, and the monastery as a whole wasn't on retreat. And there was an emergency in the kitchen, and somebody had an injury, and this person said, "Oh, I've got some some medicines and first aid things in my bag, in my accommodation," which was a few hundred meters away. And so this person was, I think they had a cut or something, they were bleeding, they needed first aid attention. And the volunteers said, well, I'll go and get it. But they were somebody who practiced the slow method. They were doing that all the time. So they slowly walked off to get the first aid kit. And watching them, they probably had a bit of doubt, oh, maybe I should speed up because there's somebody who needs attention quickly. And so they tried to walk as fast as they could within the bounds of walking slowly. You could see a sort of tension as they tried to walk slowly very quickly. And we do that sometimes. We kind of set ourselves in possible situations. So sometimes you really have to be quick if there's a need. Remember when I was looking after Ajahn Chah once, in those days, like today here in the monastery, we have thunderstorms all the time in the rainy season in Thailand. And there was a thunderstorm in the monastery and all the power went out. It's quite a common experience in thunderstorms in the forest in Thailand. And then all the equipment, the lights and the equipment for Ajahn Chah wouldn't work because there was no power. But we did have a backup generator. It was offered by Ajahn Anan actually, who realised the problem with power cuts. So he offered the generator from Wat Marp Chan to Wabapong to be put at Ajahn Chah's kuti. It's a huge generator which could be turned on in an emergency to provide power, because there was a lot of medical equipment and other things that we needed for Ajahn Chah. Needed power. But then the generator didn't work. So there wasn't mains power and the generator wasn't working, so there was still no power for Ajahn Chah. And by that time he'd had a tracheostomy, he had a hole in his throat, and sometimes we needed to pull phlegm out, otherwise there was a chance of him choking and even dying perhaps. So I had to run to get Lumpur Liam, who was in another part of the monastery. It's the only time I've ever run as a monk, more or less, that I can remember. So I just ran in the rain as fast as I could, because I didn't want Ajahn Chah to be without power. So sometimes you have to run when there's a need, and I ran to Lumpur Liam, who was doing some other job, and I said, Lumpur, the power's off, which he knew, and the generator's off too. We've got no power for Lumpur Chah. And he knew exactly what the problem was. And Lumpur Liam jumped through the window because he knew time was of the essence. So he didn't even go through the door, which was 20 meters away from where he was. He was in the hall. He just jumped through the window, and there was a nearby ute with a driver, and he commandeered that and sped off to Lumpur Chah's kuti, which is a few hundred meters away. He didn't even wait for me, so I had to run back. So I arrived a bit after Lumpur Liam, who got the generator going, and then Lumpur Chah was okay because we had power again. That's heedfulness in action, isn't it? Sometimes you need to act quick, sometimes you need to be slow. Right? When there's some kinds of dangers, you need to be very still, don't you? If you meet a snake or somebody is getting very stressed and afraid or losing their temper, sometimes the best thing is to be very patient and still. It just depends on the situation, doesn't it? But heedfulness is like this. It's what's appropriate for the moment, for that task. There's always a goal. The goal is to cultivate the Dhamma. So if it's the Dhamma of dana, say fixing a generator or helping somebody who's injured, well, practice of compassion, kindness, you do whatever's needed to complete that action, fast or slow, whatever skill is needed. Then there's the Dhamma of Sila. So in some situations maybe you're tempted to break Sila, and being heedful is just sticking to your Sila when you know there's some risk or some harm that comes to you. So say like in the case of if you're trying to quit drinking, then heedfulness is sticking to your precept. I'm not going to drink, even when people offer you a drink or you have strong desire for it, you just say no. Learning how to say no to your own desire is heedfulness, using precepts or heedfulness of the precepts. Or maybe when you're meditating, like the other day someone was saying when they get really peaceful, following the breath, and the breath gets so refined they can't sense the movement of the breath anymore. At that moment they always have a doubt come up. What do I do now? And that breaks their concentration, brings up the doubt, brings agitation to the mind. So heedfulness in that moment may be just knowing the experience you're having and not giving in to the doubt, letting the doubt go and just maintaining mindfulness on your object. This is why this quality of heedfulness is all-encompassing, because it's bringing us to the Dhamma that's needed in a situation, whether it's dana, sila, samatha, vipassana. Maybe it's just the vipassana of knowing all conditions are impermanent. Thoughts arise, pass away. Feelings arise, pass away. things change, the weather changes, the world changes. Maybe it's just knowing the changing nature of something and not giving into a reaction of fear, worry, anxiety, or some desire for things to be other than they are. So employing heedfulness or being heedful is not one thing or the other, but it's cultivating cultivating the Dhamma, the path that leads to truth. But in whatever moment, it depends what's required, doesn't it? And that partly comes through experience, back to using intelligence, wisdom, gaining experience in the practice to know what you need in any situation and what's giving rise to the Dhamma, wholesome states of mind rooted in sila, samadhi, panya, and abandoning unwholesome states of mind that rooted in greed, anger and delusion and all their offsets, all their offspring and their different variations. And that's heedfulness as well, knowing your mind. Am I falling into different kinds of unwholesome, unskillful mental states, or am I preserving the skillful, the wholesome ones? And that's heedfulness. So when Ajahn Chah used to teach this phrase, atano joti atana, knowing what am I thinking right now, that's heedfulness. And then acting, but it's not just knowing, but then acting appropriately. So if you are caught into greed, lust, or aversion, or even hatred, knowing this is a cause of suffering, that's knowing the danger, knowing the escape, and this is something to be abandoned, let go of. That's heedfulness in action, and that can be just in one moment, knowing your own mind in one situation. But you can also prepare, say, for the future. Say if you've recognized that when you hold on to thoughts of greed, anger, delusion, you end up suffering, if you've realized that already, and say you catch yourself planning some action in the future based on greed, anger and delusion, then you know that will also lead to suffering in the future. So you can change your plans in that moment. Oh, hold on, I'm going in the wrong direction here. Or as far as the past goes, or when you find yourself indulging in memories, what is your relationship to your past? A lot of our suffering is coming from dwelling on discontent, dissatisfaction to do with the past. Unpleasant memories, things that have happened that didn't go well, and just dragging it along like dead weight or some kind of burden of the mind. Heedfulness there may be recognizing that the past is over and that has to be acknowledged and then let go. Greed, anger, delusion caused you suffering in the past. It will cause you suffering in the future if you give in to it and follow it. Just getting clear on that. So then this is becoming heedful towards defilements, mental defilements, these things that cause us suffering. Like Ajahn Buddhadasa used to say, if you're somebody who can't avoid watching the news, reading the news, nowadays we're bombarded with it, whether we like it or not. People tell you the news even if you don't read it. He said, well, apply the Dhamma to it. Say, when you hear the news, one of the things they like to tell you about is what the world is doing, what your government is doing, what people are doing. And often it's centered around money, isn't it? How people spend money. The government spends money, other people spend money, how you're planning to spend money. Ask yourself, well, in your plans to spend money, in your decisions on how you spend the money you earn, are you being governed or ruled by defilement? greed, anger, delusion, or by the Dhamma. And that's heedfulness as well. So Lumpur Buddhadasa said, do a survey of the news and just what you'll find is the majority of money that is spent in the world is spent actually for defilement and to promote defilement, meaning greed, anger and delusion. That doesn't mean to say all money is spent in that way. There's a lot of charity done, there's a lot of good things done with money as well. But the majority is spent to promote either people's greed or their anger and hatred or delusion. You can learn in that way. You become heedful even just looking at the news, and you become aware, these are the kind of qualities that govern so much of human behavior. And money is a big thing for everyone, isn't it? Can't escape from it. Then you can bring that into your own practice. Well, how am I going to spend the money that I earn? Am I going to spend it with greed, or with anger, or delusion? Are you endlessly seeking more money to buy more things and sort of caught on the treadmill and the conveyor belt of greed in the world? And as I said, it doesn't mean to say every bit of money you spend is coming and promoting greed or supporting greed, but where does greed come into how you spend your money? Or is it to do with aversion? Sometimes we're spending money just to get the better of other people. If we want to be better than those people we don't like, sometimes it's through jealousy or envy, sometimes it's through competitiveness, conceit, sometimes it's through views. We should spend our money on this and not that. Why does that group get their money and not us? And so on. This is all to be investigated. A lot of it is planning, isn't it? We often talk about the way we spend money before we spend it, what I'm going to spend it on. Just ask yourself, well, in that conversation you're having with yourself about the way you spend your money, is it being governed by wisdom, compassion, kindness, mindfulness, or is it being governed by greed, anger and delusion of one sort or another? You can apply this same way of thinking to everything you do, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, how you relate to other people. And sometimes we relate to other people in a very kind of materialistic way. We just think of them more in who we can use for somehow to our advantage, to get ahead. I can use this connection, this person. Or if somebody is no use to us, we say, well, this person is no use to us. And we just kind of write them off. Is that coming from greed, anger, delusion, or wisdom and compassion, mindfulness? If you want the real end of suffering, then we're always coming back to sila, samadhi, panya, mindfulness, wisdom. And we're looking for ways to abandon greed, anger and delusion. The way we relate to other people, the way we think about them, and then obviously the way we talk to them, the way we act towards them. We have nowadays in the world, we have very corporate mentality. We look at people as kind of units of production, and everything is in terms of time, output, even areas that doesn't really fit, but we still do it. Say in education, units of output, how well a teacher teaches, judging them by the exam results of their pupils, even though every pupil is going to be different and every group of pupils is different. Still we're sort of competing and judging and comparing teachers, doctors the same. It becomes very corporate, the way clinics are run, hospitals are run. And that gives rise to politics, because politics tends to be all about how the money is spent, who has the power to decide how the money is spent. So you get those situations when it becomes more of a money thing, then some people are afraid to get treated by a doctor because of the money, or because the doctor needs money paid, or the hospital charges fees. Then people sometimes just give up on it. Don't want to get a checkup, don't want to get scans and whatever, because it costs. I'm just speaking very generally here, but the idea is to see that greed, anger, delusion influences everything, doesn't it? And if you're being heedful, then you start to notice that, because this is where the Buddha said suffering arises from. And if you're keen to free yourself and others from suffering, then this is what we have to investigate. Not just out in the world, but even in our spiritual practice, Dhamma practice, we have this way we call spiritual materialism. We're kind of practicing ticking the boxes. I've done my dana for the day, I've done my meditation for the day, I kept my precepts for the day, I did my chanting, or I listened to the Dhamma for the day, done everything, I'm a good Buddhist, ticked all the boxes. But maybe it's done in a more a way that promotes, say, a form of spiritual greed or attachment. I've ticked all the boxes, therefore I should be happy. But it doesn't always work as simply as that. Especially if you're attaching to what you do, or there's greed slipping into what you're doing. It's so easy, isn't it? And why are we not so peaceful when we meditate? Well, often it's because there's some greed saying, I want something from this meditation. I want to be peaceful, I want to know something, I want to get something, some special state. So you're actually setting up the causes to not be peaceful. The very thing you want is being pushed further and further away, because the root cause is incorrect. We say practicing with craving. Or even sometimes we want to be somebody who's kind or generous. We have an ideal that we aspire to. So we're constantly trying to prove that ideal to ourselves and then to other people, but not recognizing maybe it's actually becoming an attachment. And of course, if you aspire to be a generous person or kind person or well known for that, then if you're not well known for that, or somebody criticizes you, then it throws you into suffering, doesn't it? It doesn't mean to say it's not right to be kind or generous, but it's more the attachment that slips into our thinking. Or maybe with the attachment to kindness, then we get worry and insecurity. Maybe we're worried about people we're kind to. Are they all right? What's going to happen to them? So we get caught into anxiety rather than maintaining awareness. So both living with fellow practitioners and associating with them, and then also taking responsibility for your own practice at the same time, knowing how to teach yourself, reflect on your own thoughts and motivations in your own life. These two aspects are the way we practice with heedfulness. It's something, it's the very last teaching the Buddha left us, so it must mean it's important. That's one reflection in itself, isn't it? The very last thing that Buddha said is practice with heedfulness. And it's something Ajahn Chah, in the modern era, teacher, reminded us over and over again, be heedful, because everything can change. The world can change, our health can change. The opportunity to practice can disappear for whatever reason quite quickly, or at least be affected by events and conditions around us. But we do know for sure we won't be here forever, because everything is impermanence. So keep practicing. Strive on with heedfulness. So maybe I'll leave you with these reflections tonight.